sit back in your seats, get something to eat, and watch this movie. Don't let the kiddies see it, because, well, we'll let you hear the beginning first. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Left of the Projector. I am your host, Evan, back again with another film discussion from the left. Before we get into our conversation this week, I wanted to make a couple quick housekeeping announcements. The first, in addition to the already existing TikTok account, Left of the Projector Pod, and YouTube account, Left of the Projector Pod, you can also follow the show on Instagram at also Left of the Projector Pod. So whatever your platform of choice is, but yes, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram at Left of the Projector Pod. All right. Thank you for joining me. This is Leftist Down Under, and we're here to talk about Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk about this movie.
Yes, this is a great movie, and so I don't know. We talked a bit offline about the how much of a classic this is, and if you haven't seen it in a while, you should definitely go watch it. But what's your kind of memories of this movie? Before we dive in.
I mean, I would have been watching this movie like when I was a kid. My dad probably would have shown it to me, and have just loved it ever since. Like almost every frame of it just like burned into my brain. And every time I go back and watch it again, I just love it more and more and more, and just find new things to be fascinated by. This is like, it's one of my all-time favorite movies. And every time I watch it, it's completely reaffirmed how terrific it is.
It is. It is a great movie. And I was saying, as a kid, I mean, this is maybe the case for lots of movies. When you're younger, or even as a teenager, you watch these movies and it's cool. And for me, my first recollection is just how inventive and how interesting it was, where you have toons interacting with cartoons, interacting with actual people. And that's kind of where you start the show or the movie is you have, Roger Rabbit, the obviously main character, the toon character, is interacting in a scene for his cartoon show. And then you move directly into that awakening of seeing the two worlds intermix. And so do you remember that being the kind of the aspect at first that made it so groundbreaking as a movie?
Oh, I definitely, I watched like, Looney Tunes and everything. We had like a little collection of like really old classic Looney Tunes cartoons that I would like watch on repeat, some of those really early Bugs Bunny ones. And so starting up the movie with just one of those cartoons and, little me is clapping along, he's having a great time.
Yeah.
And then the cut, right? Roger gets the fridge on his head and then it cuts away and everything looks slightly different. And suddenly there's a person in the frame. Mind blowing as a child. I was like, I cannot even believe this. And I mean, got to avoid talking too much about like the quality of the filmmaking, but this really like paved the way for so much stuff that came after it in terms of the interactions between like, 2D characters in this case. But if you think about what movies are like now, almost all of it is real people acting against digital stuff that they can't see.
Exactly.
And like this movie kind of is a real pioneer in that kind of area for what we now have. Exactly.
Yeah, it really was that first introduction. And, obviously this being a Disney movie, they're able to use, they can introduce any of the Disney characters they want to. And one of the funniest scenes, and maybe we'll get into some of the major themes of this movie. But one of the lines that stuck out to me when we have the main character of the movie, Eddie Valiant, who's played by Bob Hoskins, he's talking to R.K. Maroon, who's the head of the pictures, Maroon. And the funny thing, they have this interaction, and I wrote down a quote that says, we got him on loan from Disney, as Maroon's referring to Dumbo. And then he says, the best part is they work for peanuts, and he's referring to Dumbo as an elephant with peanuts. But for me, that line is kind of like this precursor to one of the major themes of the movie, which I never noticed as a kid or even as a teenager, is like the working class and the class relations in this movie of the the toons versus the directors and the elite of Hollywood. So I don't know if you remember that line, and if that's,
No,
yeah.
It stuck out to me really clearly on the rewatch. I've always thought that was just like a funny joke. They work for peanuts because he's an elephant and he likes peanuts. But yeah, rewatching it with the framework of like this conversation in mind stuck out like a sore thumb. Like I also because he talks about getting him on loan from Disney, and that really evoked kind of like the old Hollywood like contracts that they would have with the movie stars, where the movie stars effectively like belonged to the studios. Like Dumbo belongs to Disney because of whatever the nature of the kind of contract is with the toons. So Disney can just loan him to a different studio.
Yeah, I didn't think of the contract aspect of it, but yeah, that line really stuck out. And so, the beginnings, this is kind of the early stages. You're just kind of getting a sense of what Eddie Valiant's kind of role is. He's this private detective, where he now needs to get some pictures to get, Roger Rabbit kind of back on track. He's kind of, upset about his wife, Jessica Rabbit. And so this is kind of the unfolding of what will be to come. But that aspect of the class relations kind of jumps in immediately after this, where you have Eddie he needs to take the train, the trolley cars that you had in every city in the 40s. So this year, this was set in 1947, just to kind of lay that little bit in there. But, you see him not being able to get on because he doesn't have any cash, and he jumps on with the trolley. I don't know. There's a name for the people who jump on the train, but I can't think of what it is. So you kind of already are seeing this aspect of old LA with these trolley cars, which obviously don't exist today. And it's just kind of a smack in the face to me, because you think of LA and you think of traffic. That's the one thing you think of. So I think then this is also going to be such an important role in this movie, the cars and the train. So I don't know how you viewed that and through the lens of modern times.
In terms of, it's part of what makes kind of the structure of the movie so terrific, because, you get that introduction of the world building, the sort of class relations between, the owners of the studio and the toons and how they're kind of treated. And then immediately you get that scene where he tries to get on the red car and hops on the back. He helps the little kids and then says, who would take a car in LA? We got the best public transport in the world.
That line is so good.
And then, and it's a great line, and it cuts immediately to then the Cloverleaf sign being pulled over, basically the same slogan on the Pacific Electric depot. And, that I think, perfectly establishes the themes of the movie there in terms of this kind of monopoly capitalism that's emerging and consuming these things around it. Even before you kind of understand exactly what's going on, you can see something's not quite right here.
Yeah, exactly. The that's something I never noticed before, the sign behind them. And it's, it's almost like it's a perfect precursor to the movie, because, as I'm sure we'll discuss as we talk more about the trains and the cars aspect, but Greenleaf was really a stand-in for an actual company. People, I didn't realize this till a couple of years ago, that Greenleaf is supposed to be National City Lines, which was an actual company that was basically created by GM and Firestone and oil to do what you said, become a monopoly over all the trains. But I think the class relations in this movie kind of fits in really well, because one of the next scenes we have is Eddie, who is an alcoholic or a drunk. He's constantly drinking throughout the movie, but he goes to a bar, which is I think it's called the station bar, I believe, where, it's in the station. They have to occasionally let the train go by and the plates bounce around because of the train. But this bar scene, I feel like, is a really, really cool moment where you see the average working people in Hollywood away from the movie set of all the Hollywood stars.
Yeah, no, there's no kind of like, glitz and glamour of LA or old Hollywood kind of thing, but instead you get this kind of, look at, I guess, that kind of the underclass, the working class of LA that's keeping everything running. And one of the first things that you see in that bar scene as Eddie goes in is Earl, the red car driver, slumped over, surrounded by wreckage and refuse and half-drunk beers and everything. And Eddie asks what happened, and he got laid off because Cloverleaf bought the red car and they made cutbacks and he lost his job. That's like one of the first introductions that you get. So again, we see the sign, and then straight away after that, we see Earl. He's been laid off. All right, so this is bad. We're supposed to understand that this is not good for the working people. And I love the line that Eddie has as he toasts, "Here's to the pencil pushers. May they all get lead poisoning."
Yes, that I never noticed that line like really distinctly before, but I felt when I saw that, when I wrote that one down too. It's you have Cloverleaf now is taking over, and they're laying off the people because what they want ultimately is they want Red Line to fail, the red car to fail, but to do this when they, just like we see now, companies will lay people off, profits will shrink, and then they can sell off for parts and do whatever they want. And that's what they're doing here. And that bar scene really shows you the one side of everything. And then very soon after, because what Eddie's doing is getting a camera from, really the only female character in this, Dolores, played by Joanna Cassidy. And he gets a camera because he has to go take pictures to use for his payday. And the next scene after this is the complete opposite of this bar. It's the elite secret club where you need a code to get in. And, it's all the rich people drinking fancy drinks. And so it's a really good juxtaposition between the first bar scene. We now have this. Now this is the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, like you said.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, obviously I think it's called the Ink and Paint Club. Yeah. This underground place that he goes to. And, you get more of that kind of, divisions between human beings and the toons, because it's a toon review, strictly humans only, is what R.K. Maroon says. So all of the toons are the workers, they are the entertainers, they're the bar staff, and they are not permitted to be patrons in this establishment that they work in, which, I mean, there's obviously a lot of class analysis to be had with the toons, but I think it is also important to acknowledge that there is a distinctly racial aspect as well, in terms of a commentary on the sort of history of, segregation in the United States. And even cartoons themselves, the origins of animated kind of entertainment has its origins in minstrel shows. And that's part of the original kind of designs for a lot of those early cartoons were based on minstrels, and a lot of that kind of chaotic violence and everything that was part of those shows is also what kind of laid the foundations for early cartoons. And I noticed that really sharply watching the performance between Donald and Daffy Duck as they're just going at each other and everything, that this is what cartoons were, and they have that origin specifically in this kind of this minstrel performance. And I think it's really interesting, the kind of commentary there on making that more explicit in the movie, that these are sort of to be taken as a commentary not just on class but also on race relations in 1940s America. And I don't have a grounding to say much more than that. I'm not going to try and put too much analysis on a lived experience I don't have, but I think it is important to acknowledge the history of cartoons and the commentary then that the movie is making.
I mean, it's not very, it's subtle, but in a way that it's clear what Robert Zemeckis was doing with the movie. And I think the thing that I noticed in that elite club was both the class, but as you said, sort of the racial aspect, where at that time the people who are doing the dishes and cleaning and cooking and all those things weren't going to be presumably the white part of the community. It was the black. And then I think that also gets you back to the train aspect, where in in that time in the 40s when there was the ability to use the trains, you could easily live outside of the city and you could commute very, quickly as, if you didn't live there. And even so, you even had people who weren't rich might be using the train just because it wasn't as much seen as a class aspect. It was just, this is the great ability of being in a city. So I just thought of that too, that might be a little bit off.
No, yeah. Public transportation is kind of, it's egalitarian in that way.
That's it, yes.
Because anybody, even if you can afford other transportation, why would you when you can, as Eddie says towards the end of the movie, when you can take the red car for a nickel? Like, even if you have money, it's right there, it's cheap, it's effective. And so even if you have several dollars in your pocket or you only have a nickel, everyone can just take the red car, and why wouldn't they do that?
It's very soon after this that we then are introduced to the villain of this movie, which is Judge Doom, played by Christopher Lloyd, a very excellent, one of my, great actor. And in this movie, he's quite excellent. And so the kind of the way you get there is because of these pictures, Roger Rabbit sort of freaks out. And the next thing that happens is we have the murder of a character we didn't mention, Marvin Acme. Maybe we want to talk about him a little bit, but he is the owner of Acme, and he also owns Toontown, which is sort of this segregated aspect of Hollywood, which again, it gets to that both class and racial divide of, cities at this time, because lots of major cities in the United States were very divided. But you could access them because of that public transportation, which was then destroyed. And then the highways were literally built right through their homes. So I think before we get in there, I think talking about Toontown, I think is important.
Toontown is, it's such a crucial kind of component of the movie. The whole plot revolves around Toontown and who has access to it, who has ownership of it. Which makes it interesting that we sort of see it so little and we kind of understand so little about it. We only really hear about it from most of the movie. But it absolutely is both it has elements of that class and race relations, really. The Toons live in this designated, segregated area. People, like human beings, don't really tend to go there because, Eddie hates it for his own character reasons.
Right.
But he gets very upset at the start of the movie at the notion that he might have to go into Toontown. But, no one questions the fact that Judge Doom, being a human being, is his jurisdiction is Toontown. He's running that, from the judicial aspect. And no one has any real questions as to the fact that a human being is presiding over the Toons, in the same way that no one has any questions that Marvin Acme owns Toontown. It belongs to him. Exactly. Because he's portrayed as this kind of like, goofy, fun-loving, jokester and prankster and everything. But he owns a factory. He's literally a capitalist. And he just owns the land that all of these working class people live on. And they just truck themselves over, work at the studio across the road from the factory, and then, back to Toontown they go. It's kind of a company town almost in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the only way you can get there, other than we see later, literally the wall breaks down, but they have to go through that tunnel. And so it's very, I feel like in my mind, I thought of like, that's like this way to segregate the two. And it didn't seem like there was a train. There really wasn't clear how you're getting through there without a car. I guess presumably as Toons, they might have some other route, but that clearly was a distinction to make it show the separation between the two. Marvin Acme is meant to be kind of like a good guy because eventually, because of what he did, he saved them. But really, he's not a great guy because he's exploiting the people he pretends or portrays as loving.
Exactly. And, also, the whole subplot with his will being so crucial, and he literally turned that into a prank. He hung the lives and well-beings of all of the people that lived in Toontown on this gag that he presumably thought was very funny. So yeah, we don't get to know him very much, but what we do sort of get to see is, you know, he's presenting as this jokester, but he is a profoundly inconsiderate man.
Yeah, so he makes people laugh, you know, presumably with all of his things. Well, I don't know if he's inventing them really. It's someone else's. He's getting the credit because everything says Acme on them.
Yep.
But he's not. He's meant to be this. I know. I was going to say he's almost like a class traitor, but really he isn't because he is a capitalist. But then I guess that brings me to the next scene where we're at his factory, and we see that he's now been murdered, and they now are trying to pin it on Roger Rabbit, as it wouldn't be called Who Framed Roger Rabbit if it wasn't him being pinned to murder. But so we now meet Judge Doom, and we meet the cops, and we see the human cops at first. And so we don't know at this point who Judge Doom is, but you mentioned he's sort of like has jurisdiction, but really he's kind of like judge, jury, and executioner because he has the ability to just kind of do what he wants. Humans don't see the Toons as real people, so they don't care what happens to them. So, you know, in this scene, we also see the weasels who are the Toon cops, if you will. And so all of them are really kind of class traitors. And then at the end, when we discover what Doom really is, he's kind of the ultimate class traitor, as he is a Toon killing other Toons and hunting them down. So the weasels always, to me, were kind of like a little scary aspect as a kid, but in watching it as an adult, they're not. They're just police, you know, going against their own.
Yeah, no, I think class traitors is definitely apt. If we sort of understand the Toons as these kind of working class exploited people, then yeah, Doom is the ultimate class traitor, and the weasels are just, you know, his little subordinates. And yeah, you know, Roger mentions kind of later on that like there's no justice for Toons anymore. That it has this implication that yeah, Doom and his weasels are just going around Toontown, just carrying out these extrajudicial executions.
Yep.
Just cracking open a canister of dip and just murdering Toons for any kind of minor infraction or anything that just gets in the way of Doom and his kind of ultimate plan. And I always wondered, you know, how has this guy, like, where did he come from? What's the sort of connection there? You know, like when I was watching it as a kid, I just didn't kind of piece it together exactly what had gone on. But, you know, we find out through the movie, obviously, that, you know, Doom at one point in time, like, robbed a bank, I think Eddie says, and made off with a zillion simoleons.
Yep.
And then the cop that's talking to Eddie in the factory when they, you know, arrive at the crime scene says that, you know, Eddie asks, how did this guy become a judge? And the cop tells him, well, you know, a couple of years back, he spread a bunch of simoleons around Toontown, bought the election.
Gargoyle get to be a judge. Spread a bunch of simoleons around Toontown a couple of years back, bought the election. Huh? What's that? Remember how we always thought there wasn't a way to kill a Toon? Well, Doom found the way. Turpentine, acetone, benzene. He calls it the dip.
So you know, which is sort of, you know, it's kind of silly in the kind of context, but it's like that's a real thing that continues to happen.
Literally right now.
Yeah, right. The ways that money influences the judiciary. It's supposed to be this kind of, you know, separate thing, this separate organ, you know, to the rest of it that couldn't just be bought off, but it absolutely can, and it does. And then we see here that the consequences of that corruption are very, very real for the Toons who are being kind of killed in the street, but humans don't really care. It's because, you know, the lives of Toons don't really kind of matter to them, really. They're kind of morbidly horrified that Doom has concocted this dip, you know, to actually kill them because it's supposed to be impossible to kill a Toon. But they're not really that concerned about the actual, like, morality and justice and due process and everything like that.
No.
It's just kind of a bit terrifying that he's managed to do it. But man, what are you going to do? You know?
Yeah, and the thing that I was trying to think of when I was just now, when you were talking about the dip, which is the, the turpentine and they talk about what goes into it. But
yeah, it's like nail polish remover, basically.
Right. And so I was trying to think in my head, is something like if obviously it's on the face of it, it's this liquid that can kill tunes that they didn't think were possible to kill. But I was trying to think if it's like meant to be some kind of metaphor, or if it's simply just, this is just kind of this, to use like a lame term, like a plot device to have something where, that they all fear. All the tunes now fear Dip as this way to control them in some sense, because they now have to be, do what they're told, or they'll face the consequences of, execution in this way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there is definitely something within that in terms of like the fear of, repercussion and violence. Is something that the Toons didn't have to face before Doom arrived. They were able to just kind of go about their business because nothing physical could really hurt them in any way. But as soon as you introduce this organized threat of violence in the form of Doom and the Toon Patrol, with this mechanism now to actually inflict harm on the Toons, suddenly their behavior kind of changes, because now there is real stakes. And I definitely think there is something in that, in terms of like, the sort of formation of organized policing. And obviously, particularly in the United States, where policing is so lethal, particularly to marginalized communities, that the ways that people's behavior can be kind of controlled with the immediate threat of violence. That's how people come to understand the interaction. Judge Doom at no point is a sort of beacon of justice or helping the community. He's only a threat to the Toons.
But the thing that also I was thinking about Judge Doom too is that, so he is a judge in the sense of, the legal aspect of it. But what he's really doing, because he's buying all this controlling stake in Cloverleaf, it kind of reminds me of sort of the political aspect of modern politics where, someone goes into politics for a number of years, they make connections, and then they go to the private sector where they can make all their money.
I'm retiring to take a new role in the private sector.
Literally they've directed policy that will then help them in the future. So really what he's doing is he's creating the conditions so that he can then profit off of it after he's, presumably no longer needs to be a judge, because he'll rake in the profits from his highway plan.
Yes, no, absolutely. That being a judge is just a stepping stone in his kind of grand design. The things that he wants to get done is to accomplish, this grand vision of the freeway and, the sort of, I guess, to jump ahead, the billboards. That was what really struck me, was the delivery on the wonderful, wonderful billboards.
As high as the eye can see, or as far as the eye can see.
As high as the eye can see. And that's his grand vision that he's had for all of this time, and all of these terrible things that he's done along the way. People that he's hurt and people that he's killed, including, obviously, as we find out, Eddie's brother, just to accomplish this dystopian kind of vision of the future of just strings of gas stations and fast food restaurants and cheap motels and billboards.
Where Toontown once stood will be a string of gas stations, inexpensive motels, restaurants that serve rapidly prepared food, tire salons, automobile dealerships, and wonderful, wonderful billboards reaching as far as the eye can see. My God, it'll be beautiful.
Yes, it's kind of amazing. You think about it. You can't even imagine, like now, you can't even imagine a time where that didn't exist. But as we see later, is Eddie can't even fathom this plan. I know we're kind of jumping towards the end, but it's such a it's so prophetic, and it's hard. Even at the time, anyone who Doom would have talked to at the time wouldn't have understood this, with the exception of the large corporations that had this vision of how they could expand their reach. And so it's kind of like with them taking over Cloverleaf, the privatization of, public utilities like we had last year with Texas. Their power grid went out and it's a private company and they can do what they want and they can keep the power on in the wealthy neighborhood and keep the people in the dark and the poor neighborhood. So, he doesn't care. He's just out there to privatize everything, including Toontown.
Yeah, exactly. And he's acquired this position as a judge to weaken Toontown, to make it just painful and difficult for the Toons to live in. And we don't really see a lot of the kind of after effects of that as it kind of ripples out. Because Marvin Acme is obviously killed, very quickly at the start of the movie. And one of the things in terms of, I guess, the timeline of the film that I never really noticed too much is that it all happens very quickly. Like the whole movie takes place over literally 2 days. And so we don't really get to see exactly we don't see too much of Toontown. We don't know what it's like in Toontown with Doom and the Weasels rolling around, but we can imagine that it would be pretty terrible and that maybe Toons would kind of be more willing to subject themselves to terrible working conditions to attempt to kind of get away from that, which is then obviously beneficial to someone like R.K. Maroon, whose business model revolves around exploiting the labor of the Toons.
Maybe we can get into, I think the ending of the movie, the last kind of payoff is really where I feel like a lot of the plots and the themes kind of come together. We have the public and private sector. We have the city planning, his grand plan. So, go ahead.
Like we sort of discussed a little bit just prior, that like there's not a lot of kind of, thematic movement in the kind of middle chunk, but we know we need Marvin Acme's will because the Toons believe that Marvin Acme promised that they would inherit Toontown when he died. So that kind of is the central kind of conflict, that they're trying to get this will before the auction for the probate of Marvin Acme's, kind of possessions and the things that he owns and everything, including Toontown, is finalized. And that's kind of one of the first things that we see is that Cloverleaf, that was buying the red car, also put in the highest bid for Toontown. Right. We learn that. And then, we have a little chase scene and, we go through a few little motions there. And then the kind of moment that brings everything together for Eddie is that Cloverleaf also bought R.K. Maroon's studio. So we see the kind of thing that brings everything together is this kind of monopoly capitalism emerging. Yep. This entity that is buying both public transportation networks and wants Toontown and wants a movie studio for some reason. And we learn from R.K. Maroon before he's shot back by Judge Doom that it's because they wanted the real estate, they wanted the land, and they want the land for Toontown as well.
The final scene of this movie is I think there's a lot to discuss about it. It's one of my it's one of my favorite scenes of movies of that time when I was a kid. The Roger Rabbit and Jessica Rabbit are dangling from the rope, and the dip spray is like always almost going to get them.
Yeah.
And it's always so funny because it seems like it's moving so fast and like somehow it's, suspended animation it doesn't get them.
Never quite gets there.
Right. Which obviously, but the last few, minutes of the movie or that last scene is meant to only be like 10 or 15 minutes because it's almost midnight, and midnight's when he takes over. So just like the movie is a short period, this last scene, and this is like any other kind of movie where the villain is now, he's the villain as Judge Doom, but he's also, the evil Toon gives away his whole plan. He describes it, and, Eddie saying, he doesn't understand this. And one of the lines that Doom says, like, because you lack vision, he doesn't understand the world beyond just his kind of Hollywood little bubble of day-to-day life.
Yeah. And the final scene when that all kind of comes together, Roger gets a great little monologue in there about how, Toons might act stupid, but they're not. you know, they're capable of demanding kind of real justice and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, Doom lays it out. You know, he's the sole stockholder of Cloverleaf. He's behind the whole thing. And the reason that he wants to do all this, he just wants to commit genocide against the Toons, basically, is to build a freeway. That's the whole thing. And they bought the red car to dismantle it, which is just this kind of one-off line, really. But it's so fascinating because one of the most interesting things, I guess, about people's relationship with this movie is the sort of revelation that comes at some point that this is, to an extent, based on a true story.
Exactly.
And that is a real thing that happened. And I think that's what makes, like, one of my favorite lines in this, especially from this kind of analytical framework, right, is after the reveal that Judge Doom is a Toon, and Eddie says that, you know, that lame brain, which is, you know, a bit of the time, but that freeway idea could only be cooked up by a Toon.
Really? That lame brain freeway idea could only be cooked up by a Toon.
And I think for that, you kind of have to remove some of the sort of like allegorical elements in terms of the Toons as stand-ins for working class people or people of color. And that look at that kind of from a literal point of view of like this villainous scheme could only be cooked up by a Toon, by a cartoon, because it's cartoonishly evil to purchase a public utility just to dismantle it, just to force people to drive on this concrete monstrosity of cheap motels and gas stations and billboards, this horrific dystopian nightmare that is Judge Doom's vision, this grand scheme that he's concocted that just sounds so awful on the face of it. All of this could only be cooked up by a cartoonishly evil being. And it literally happened. It's real life. That is a real actual thing that happened. And it is cartoonishly evil. They paved over like communities of marginalized people and bought public utilities out from underneath people just to force them to use this ridiculous freeway that then just created all of these new problems and everything. The grand kind of overarching scheme of monopoly capitalism, purchasing public goods to make more profits for itself is cartoonishly evil.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I hadn't. It's a good framework to say you kind of remove those other pieces and look at it that way. I caught the line. It's a good one, but I didn't think of some of those things. But you're right about the, you know, taking a public good and destroying neighborhoods, and you know, the U.S. government using eminent domain to destroy the neighborhoods, as you said, literally paving through. I mean, I follow an account on Instagram that solely talks about and shows kind of before and after images of highways and all the things that it destroyed. You know, the in New York, the Cross Bronx Expressway basically destroyed. I think it's one of the most destructive highways ever built in the country or world, like worse than even, you know, hundreds of years ago in some of the old ancient type of roads they would have built. It's just plus it's hideous and it's terrible for the environment. Terrible for the environment. I mean, you look at the companies in real life. I think I mentioned this earlier. GM, you know, oil, Firestone, all the things that needed to sell more products, their tires and their oil and their car, to build this, you know, monstrosity that's just yeah, there's done nothing. I mean, yeah, you can travel from far distances, but very slowly and very dangerously.
That's the thing, you know, like the concern was traffic, you know, that's even what Doom says in the movie, you know, that traffic is such a problem. But like what they've done doesn't reduce traffic at all. And even building a freeway by itself might have helped, but then you removed the other options for people to travel and forced them to buy cars, and therefore you increase the amount of traffic that there is, which is the kind of the fundamental irrationality of capitalists, that it's not about what makes sense. It's not about organizing production or creation or manufacturing in a way that is rational to solve people's problems. They present like it is, but it's not. It's just to make money. It is just to generate profit. And so you see even that irrationality in the movie, those contradictions of Doom's scheme, that we're going to build this freeway through the communities of marginalized people to alleviate traffic. And just to make sure that everyone uses it, we're also going to remove everyone else's options for transport. So it's the only thing that you can use.
And he says the line that is just so insane. He says, traffic jams will be a thing of the past.
Yes. Right.
Which, if anyone's ever been to Los Angeles, you will know that is complete horseshit. It is so, I mean, most cities, but LA is like you think of as like the infamous traffic, and I think when you actually build for every lane of highway you build in any city, it doesn't do anything except just, it's a 1-to-1 cars to lanes. So
yes,
build more lanes.
For as much as you expand the highways, you increase traffic by that much.
Right. But yeah, the other thing I was, I noted too was, kind of like the aspect of the city planning, which we kind of touched on a little bit with, how they destroyed communities, but really there was kind of this conspiring because in the real life version where you have the plan, I'm blanking on the Highway Act now. It was the Federal Highway Act that basically set aside enough money to build 42,000 miles of highway. But at that time in the late 40s, there was actually more rail miles than there were going to be highway miles. So like you said, they took away the thing. It is one thing if they put in all the miles of highway, but if they had left all of the rail, presumably they still would have made just as much, maybe just slightly less money because people will take the nickel red car.
That is kind of, it's a real contributing factor to the current state of the United States in terms of the, complete lack of substantial public transportation across the country is, because they spent all this money building the highways, building the interstates, and got rid of the actual public transportation that was there at the time, because rail, rail is hard to make a profit off of. You kind of have to operate rail more like a service. And auto manufacturers wanted a bigger market. They wanted more money. And so they, and that's the thing, city, local councils, because Doom says that he found it in the sort of plans of the LA City Council.
Right.
Originally. That was the original conception, was that they had this plan to try to reduce congestion. They were going to build a freeway. And it's not enough to do that as a sort of utility, as an attempt to, make life easier for the citizens. You also have to remove the competition, remove the alternative. So, and again, that's exactly what happened in real life, both in LA with the red car specifically, but also, around the United States, building all of this interstate to create more of a market for auto manufacturers and reducing the amount of available rail so that everyone just has to drive. The only way to get from one end of the country to the other is by driving until, domestic flights were cheap enough.
And then the other thing too, which is kind of an added layer to it, is because obviously you had some suburban areas, but mostly, especially United States, and sort of the central part where you have more of a farming and agricultural aspect. The people lived mostly in these cities, and creating the highways enabled all of the other capital interests to then create, modern suburbs, and especially being, this is 1947, post World War II. Mm-hmm. You wanted to expand, give people, cheap housing and build these hideous suburbs. So that was another aspect, is they needed to then build places in between all of those, he was saying the gas stations and the fast food and all these things. So it was really it wasn't just the expansion of the single, just to have the road for the cars. It was just an expansion of everything.
Yeah, no, the sort of the decision to make the United States and its cities especially so car centric, then resulted, in this fundamental shift in the way that living was organized, because it was all built and planned around cars. And then you end up with like, yeah, that, you know, hideous suburbanization and everything. And that's kind of part of Doom's little villainous monologue, is that he wants it to be this central little hub right over Toontown, right? People get off and on all day, all night. That's what he wants, is just people driving forever. And you know, the real consequences of that in terms of something like climate change obviously wouldn't really be kind of felt for a long time afterwards, in terms of when the movie is set, and even really when the movie is made. You know, like 1988 is still pretty early days for that kind of conscious awareness, really, of what we had done. But the dystopian kind of nature of Doom's vision, I think, is still very present. That, you know, that Zemeckis has taken the outcomes here and applied it backwards as if it was done with intent. Because I think that's the other thing, is that a lot of these things kind of happened as consequences of a lot of these decisions, but it's not exactly like some shadowy board members were sitting around being like, oh, we're going to make everyone's life miserable and we're going to force everyone out into these suburbs and everything. It just kind of happened as a consequence of the pursuit of profits.
Right.
But what if someone knew full well that this was what it was going to look like? Well, they would be a villain, and not just a villain. They would be a cartoon villain. They would be so beyond understanding that they couldn't even be a normal human being. They would have to be a cartoon character to think that this was a desirable outcome.
Yeah, it's really a master line and a sort of a perfect ending, which I know we did talk about the ending of, you know, him revealing his plan, but then the ultimate ending is that he gets run over by a paver, which presumably should kill him if he had been human, but we now discover sort of the last moments of the movie that he's actually was a Toon. And then a few moments later, Eddie learns that it's the same Toon who had killed his brother. And then that last scene is always so great. And I think the part where his eyes pop out as swords, I remember kind of being scared of that as a little kid. But that scene is so great. And, you know, he inevitably kills him with this Acme kind of sticky paste, which I feel like is kind of a funny nod where Acme, you know, is now dead. He had killed him, and it's actually Acme that then kills him back, or return accidentally, if you will.
Well, yeah, I do love. I mean, I love all the aspects of that fight, both like before and after the reveal that he's a Toon, right? In terms of Eddie using all of the cartoon props and the singing sword and the magnet and everything. But yeah, that it is Acme ultimately that kind of saves the day, because even after, because, you know, he gets the sticky glue and then he's under the steamroller, and then after the reveal and he's got the big cartoon like buzzsaw thing, which is amazing. It's the little mallet with the boxing glove in it that actually flicks the switch on the dip that both kills Doom and saves Roger and Jessica Rabbit dangling in front of the hose. So like it is Acme and his products and his designs and everything, you know, that actually saves the day and defeats Doom, which I think is really, I mean, it's just a really tight narrative. Like, again, not to dwell too much on the actual structure, but like all of those things, like the hole is set up in the first time we were in the factory. The mallet with the boxing glove is set up when we're in the factory and everything. Like it all just comes together very, very neatly at the end for that resolution. It's really terrific. And then after that we find the will. You know, it wraps it all up in a neat little bow. It's the Toon that killed Eddie's brother. The paint will match on the rope. You know, everything's all tied up except we don't have the will, but Roger's blank piece of paper with the love letter to Jessica, as it turns out, is the will written in disappearing, reappearing ink, because Marvin Acme, the capitalist, was just, you know, using the livelihoods and lives of all of these Toons as a practical joke, even in death.
Yes. Yeah, I think right before it is because he had used the ink on Eddie's shirt at the at the bar, and his, like, I think you see it come back, and then he's going to read her the love letter, and then he notices that it has it. Yeah, it's masterful.
Yeah. Eddie looks down, he sees the stain. I think Dolores points it out to him, and then Roger brings the bottle, and then it's disappearing, reappearing ink. Because earlier in the movie, Acme had just said that it's disappearing ink.
Right.
But I guess it reappears after presumably like 24 hours or maybe 48 or however long it's been. But again, the time frame is very short, so fair enough that's a gag that Acme has. I guess
the gags that you would see in cartoons. I mean, obviously, we're having a movie that's combining the two, but it's great how they interplay. Again, this is more of a cinematic aspect of all, like you said, the foreshadowing of all of the things, objects he would need, and just the little Acme things is such a cool touch. And then the very final kind of moment is, you know, we've saved Toontown. All the Toons are happy because they've read the will, and, you know, everyone is jumping for joy. And it's kind of, you know, almost at that point just kind of cut to credits. But what I felt when I watched it this time again, is just very unsatisfied by that. You know, yes, they're redeemed. Yes, there's this love and laughter, and they're dancing and they're happy. And you see that Eddie is now kind of can laugh along with the Toons as he couldn't at the beginning. But really, while it's a happy ending like you get in Hollywood, actually taking place in Hollywood, a little meta, and also being a Disney movie, but really, I don't know, do you find it to be unsatisfying, or how would you look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a sort of narrative construction,
yes,
I think it's a satisfying ending, because you get everything you need. You get Eddie's character growth. You know, we've saved the day. The Toons are free. Everyone's happy, and it's all worked out. And I think narratively, in terms of the arcs that we get, it's a satisfying resolution. But you're right. Thematically speaking, in terms of like the broader implications, and especially when you look at it through the lens that like you and I have decided that we're looking at it, it is kind of unsatisfying in the way that, you know, Disney movies tend to be when they try and tackle issues like this, because there's so many problems, like systemic issues that the movie implies that are left unresolved. You know, the Toons are still second-class citizens. They're still exploited for their labor. They still live in a segregated neighborhood. None of that has changed. Now they just they own Toontown, so presumably things will get better for them in that regard. They don't have to worry about, you know, Judge Doom presiding over them, but also, you know, the actual system that let Judge Doom take that power is still in place. You know, so what's to stop another Judge Doom coming along and doing something similar? Yeah. So
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. I was saying that, but you also have the
no.
The thing that kind of made it all possible for Doom was the LA City Council having plans for a freeway. So, are they going to then build around Toontown, or are they going to find some other way to, you know, eminent domain them out of the way and still do it? So, I think it was well put. Is that you still have this unresolved future issue. You kind of kicked it down the road, where you don't know what will. I mean, in real life, the Toontown is destroyed, or through it.
Because we know obviously that is what ends up happening. And you know, I think as well in terms of like, you know, standard fare, I guess, for Hollywood, where these broad systemic issues are then just kind of attributed down to one bad person. It's just that there was this one bad guy. You know, Judge Doom was the sole stockholder, but he wasn't the only person in Cloverleaf. There was executives, there was investors, there was all of this other stuff. Presumably those mechanisms are still there. They would continue functioning. You know, the red car is still going to be dismantled. People have still already lost their jobs and presumably will continue to lose their jobs. You know, just because we got rid of the one bad person doesn't mean that all of these other issues are just kind of automatically resolved. But, that is part of the course with any Hollywood movie, particularly with a Disney movie.
I don't fault them.
Yeah, in terms of, exactly, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's similar, I guess. It rings of notes like we mentioned, off air, but like it rings of notes to something like the ending of Pocahontas, where it's very kind of saccharine, and the immediate conflict has been resolved, but we know that actually there's still a series of bad things that are likely to happen after the credits roll on this movie, which leaves you with a very kind of odd feeling that you've been given this kind of saccharine, little note to end on that feels hollow, because that's not how this is going to go.
This is unrelated. I might just remove this, but I had opened the quote page from IMDb, and there's a line that Eddie says when they're in the bar looking for Roger, and they're going to presumably put him into the dip before they give him the shot of whiskey. He says, "I don't know who's toonier, you or Doom." And I didn't catch that line before.
Yes.
I heard it, but I didn't think of it. But that's clearly he actually, unbeknownst to him, sees he is actually a toon or toonie.
Yeah, no, it's very much, it's less thematic and more cinematic, but I caught that for the first time on my rewatch last night. I don't know who's toonier, you or Doom. And I did write it down, but then I was like, I don't know what the thematic payoff is here, but it's such brilliant writing. It's such an amazing foreshadowing that Eddie, who has spent so much time around toons, he understands toons better than most people would. And he immediately clocks that something is off about Doom, that he acts like a toon, and that he knows too much about how toons behave and all this kind of stuff. And it's just, it's just such a brilliant script. It's such a brilliant piece of writing and foreshadowing. One of the things in the bar, and that I think might be worth mentioning, just in terms of like a thematic element of like solidarity, because, there's Angelo, who's the guy who was like, bullying Eddie a little bit about working for toons. And Eddie says to Roger that like Angelo would sell you out, right? Like, you don't trust that guy. And Roger, he gets up on a literal soapbox, and he gives his speech about how, that laughter is the most important thing. And that's what the true connection between people is. You have to, make this actual human connection with people. And then after Roger gives his little performance and everything, they don't sell him out. And Angelo, kind of makes a joke at the judge, which is a very dangerous thing for him to do in that moment, to protect Roger. And I think that is really interesting in terms of like the working class people, working class human beings of LA showing solidarity with Roger, who they probably wouldn't have had solidarity with before. But once they actually kind of like meet him and interact with him, they then understand that like they have this camaraderie, and that he doesn't deserve to just be sold out to the cops. I think that is kind of interesting in terms of, we don't see much of interplay between the toons and other human beings, but we understand like, no, these people they have this solidarity with Roger in that moment. Yeah, we didn't discuss that. I had noted that before, where because right before he comes in, they're dancing and they're singing all together, and they realize they have, like you said, they're more in common than they sort of have been led to believe. Like, oh, there's just these guys, this group of people that are meant to make us laugh in movies, but they're actually real people. I mean, kind of, humanizes them. And Exactly. And I think it is also like, it's a really good juxtaposition with the Ink and Paint Club. If you think about like the toons are singing and dancing, but there's a clear division between the people who are watching them and ogling them and laughing at them, versus then in Dolores's bar, where they're all together. There's no kind of lines of division. Like Roger is still kind of singing and dancing for them. He's still kind of entertaining them, but there's much more of a kind of unified element, and they're all kind of laughing and playing together, rather than the clear divisions in, the ink and paint club that we saw previously. I think there's a really good juxtaposition between those two settings and those two sequences.
We've really kind of gone through a pretty good undertaking of this movie. We obviously touched a little bit on the I can't even say the word, cinematic aspects of it, which you could really talk about quite a bit. But, maybe just from the thematic aspect, did you have any last kind of observations or summation of anything you wanted to share?
I think my biggest takeaway, like thematically, I think, there's a lot of interesting stuff, obviously, with the Toons as working class people, as a kind of like racialized group, a stand-in for people of color. We didn't mention, but like the cops just automatically assume that it's Roger. Like there's no even real investigation. He's in the papers as having murdered Marvin Acme straight away. They've just decided that he's the person that did it, which obviously is something that happens in real life to people of color all the time. But I think my biggest takeaway, the biggest thing that stands out to me specifically is, the real life kind of comparisons, the true story aspect of the red car being bought so that more people would have to drive on the freeway. And that is this kind of ridiculous scheme concocted by a cartoon villain. And it is a thing that happened in real life, that capitalism is cartoonishly evil. That's my kind of ultimate takeaway from the movie, I think, thematically, is that, the cartoonishly evil nature of capitalism.
Agreed. Yeah, that's a very good summation of it. So again, thank you for joining me, and appreciate your time.
Yeah.
It's been great.
Thanks for having me.
Leftist Down Under, and if you want, I can put a link to your TikTok account and check out that great content on there. And for future episodes, you can check them out on your podcast app of choice. And thanks everyone for listening.